wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that I recently learned at a presentation by a colleague of mine called Professor James Serple. He's an expert in the human-animal bond, and he's a great guy, writes lots of really interesting, intuitive papers, and so I've borrowed a couple of slides of his, with his permission, which is unlike me, because I just steal them, as well. One of the interesting things we have is that pet keeping, if you want to think of pet keeping, actually dates back a very long time. Now, we hear about the pharaohs keeping dogs and cats and whatever for 5,000 years, but it seems that if you look really closely, figures such as 17 to 14,000 years ago, people were keeping pets. And in fact, recently, very recently, only a few months ago, some work was done which suggests that this could go way back, maybe 40,000 years. But sticking with this, at least at the moment, that shows that this bond, this pet keeping phenomenon, has been going for a very, very long time. Now, why do I bother to mention that about something that's to do with today? Well, this is how pet keeping used to be done. People would go out into the forest, typically it was remote tribes and so on. They'd go into the forests or the local area, local habitat, and they would acquire a pet from the jungle, for instance, and that pet might be a pig, it might be a macaw, it might be a primate. The downside is they'd often kill the parents and adopt, effectively, an orphan animal, an animal they'd orphaned, and they'd keep that as their pet. Now, of course, that's not good in a way, but the thing is, these animals were able to go from the forests to the people's homes and back to the forests, more or less as they saw fit. And that's important because these people weren't biologists or scientists and didn't know much about it in that sense. And we'll come back to this because these biologists and scientists, in many respects, even people like myself, are letting animals down, because these animals could go in and out of the forest and they could pick what they wanted when they wanted it. They could socialize with their own species as and when they pleased. Absolutely fine. And their affiliative traits, which are the traits that allow them to sort of mix and choose to mix with other species, were able to be played out on their own terms. They could express their normal behaviors, and they could obtain their normal diets. Micronutrients, things they might need when they're sick, things that they might just fancy at a certain time, maybe they need it when they're gestating or whatever, they could go back and forth when they wanted to and pick out what they wanted to. So how did it all go so wrong? Because now we have situations where these animals are entirely within our imprisonment, essentially. That's what it comes down to. They have to eat what we give them, behave over the tiny spaces that we allocate to them, essentially do what we say they can do and no more than that. So in 17,000 years, let's say, going by those figures, the pet trade and pet keeping habits, unlike most other things, haven't gone forward, they've gone backwards. Technologically, we're starting to understand some of the things that were important to these animals, but we're only a tiny fraction of the way forward. We've gone backwards, and a long way backwards. This wouldn't have happened 17,000 years ago. Animals cramped into, these budgerigars cramped into cages like this. One stressed bird stresses the next. Panic behavior sets out, injuries occur. Opportunities to spread disease mount because the animals are in a depressed condition. Bearded dragons kept in tiny cages, no desert. I was in a pet shop the other day doing some investigations, preparing for this presentation, and I was asking them where they came from. They said, "Oh, I come from Africa." I don't. The pet shop doesn't know where they come from, and yet they're telling other people how to keep them. No forest for this chameleon, quite common. This is the way they go. No sky. This bird. Frankly, nowhere for this. These, you can hardly see them. They're coatimundis sitting in some dingy dealer's basement in Texas. Is that a way to treat an animal? No. Quite normal for the pet trade, by the way. We'll see a lot more of this. One of the things, that's not me, by the way. I'm nowhere near enough handsome to be me. But this is a guy who works for the government, and he's been basically unraveling the pet trade and all of its complications, and he's been getting all sorts of threats from the pet trade because he's stepping on their toes. But what I'm really doing with all these next slides is showing you that there has been an explosion of evidence-based material published around the world. And none of it is good for the exotic pet trade, and to some extent for many of the domestic pets. An explosion of scientific, peer-reviewed, independent journal articles and books. I can hardly keep up with them, and I have a team of 13 scientists and researchers that continuously give me information to review that they pull from the internet. I can look at only a few percentage of it. These are just welfare papers, tiny fraction of them. There's so much science going on. The pet trade says there's no evidence to say we've got a problem. What? Nonsense. Loads of papers on the conservation and ecological implications that affect these animals caused by the exotic pet trade. Same story with invasive alien species, species that are being imported into one country from another. Shouldn't be here. They cause problems when they're released, many of them. Same story, tiny glimpse of a few of the high-quality papers that are being published on the medical issues of zoonosis, which is part of my work today. Not today, but I mean that I do nowadays. People getting sick from keeping these animals. Lots of people getting sick from keeping these animals. Allied to that is antibiotic resistance. You go to the vet, your animal has to be treated. It has to be treated. Antibiotics may be used. Same thing with human beings. And people do complain that we're using too many antibiotics in the veterinary and the medical fields. I understand that. But what we're talking about here is examples where, in particular, the pet fish industry apply antibiotics into the water of the fish that they have because they know the chances of them being stressed and dying of related diseases is so high. They try to preempt that by filling them with antibiotics and reducing the chance of infection. That causes bugs that are resistant to those antibiotics, and they're the very same treatments that we try to use in humans and animals. So it's compounding the whole issue of animal treatment as it goes. So there's masses and masses of scientific evidence against the exotic pet trade, and very, very little, if anything of any value, that supports it. I wanted to just have a quick look at just how, these are from the UK, these figures, just how the sort of proportionality of animals roughly occurs in our country. It's not that different in the, say, the US, except the scales are bigger in most cases for the animals. It's a bigger country. So if you take fish in tanks, about 9% of British homes have those. In the ponds, about 5% of British homes. We have about 24%, quarter of British homes have dogs. And you go down to reptiles, for instance. If you add all up the reptiles there, you've got about 1.1 million reptiles. And that's how they break down. So there are a lot of animals in a lot of homes. And these are the most reliable surveys that we have in the UK, done by a survey company that actually works for the government as well. They're not done on behalf of the government, but they do work for the government. And I want to look at sort of the pet shops, the pet trade, and so on in more detail here, because what you see when you go to a pet shop is essentially the highly sanitized facade that masks the tip of a very ugly iceberg. And today I want to take you through the innards of that iceberg to show you what goes on beneath the surface of the pet trade that you may well be familiar with. For instance, just a few years ago, 4 years ago, 6 vets and myself led a team of 30 animal carers when we did a raid at the request of the local community in Texas. We were anticipating there would be about 6,000 animals there. All sorts we knew, but 6,000. When we actually got in, there were 26,400 animals on site. Think about that. At a wholesalers that was supplying the United States and Europe. And when we'd finished making our assessments, we'd found that 80% of them were sick, injured, or dead. And they were throwing 500 animals a day into the rubbish bins. It's 3,500 a week, and not all of them dead, as we'll see. And what that equated to was a 70% mortality rate in the 6 weeks that it took this wholesaler to turn over its stock. 70% mortality rate in just 6 weeks. Well, we prosecuted them successfully because the judge said, I don't want this kind of stuff in my state. But the dealer's defense was to call the industry's experts in, the wider pet industry's experts in, and they said, why are you picking on this guy? 70% mortality rate at the wholesalers before they've even been sold is industry standard. The judge said, not in my state. So he became a fugitive, ran off to New Zealand. And these things become even more worrying when you think about it, because we're not looking at animals with terribly short lives and not dealing with mosquitoes or whatever. But in the case of reptiles, for example, and although I'll cover other animals, because reptiles are my kind of niche subject, I'll often bring the conversation round to them, like I often at parties bring the conversation round to me. So reptiles that are in the trade typically have natural potential longevities, lives they could potentially live up to in nature of about 8 to 120 years. Dogs have a typical potential longevity, depending on species. Some are quite short-lived, especially some of the special breeds that have their problems. 8 years to, say, 16 years. Although the average lifespan of dogs, by a study done, showed that they reached about 11. So they were reaching normal lifespans, basically. Compare that with studies done on reptiles that show that 75% of them die in just 1 year in the home. Never mind at the moment all those that die in the pre-sale environment. These are the animals that die in the home. Mortality rates compounded by more mortality rates in another sector and so on. So if we were seeing 3 out of 4 dogs in the home dying due to stress and disease, I think we'd find it unacceptable. But this is an interesting thing, because I actually attended one of the presentations at the OSPCA conference a few miles from here, which I was speaking at as well. And there was a really interesting presentation by Temple Grandin, who's a famous behaviorist. And she was saying that there's this phenomenon of bad becoming normal. Things that have been done like Daddy always did them, like the trade has always done them, and they become normalized. And then when you come along with a view that seems to challenge it, you're the outsider, you're the strange one, you're the crank. Bad has become normal, and people think that it's quite acceptable to have these high mortality rates in animals. And it's not just me and the scientific communities that's saying this, it's the government. The government essentially says that when it comes to these animals, well, they don't make it much past a year, if that. So it's well recognized in all the right places, but not pet trades and hobbyist communities where these people essentially live a blinkered life. And if you look at, just very quickly, I won't go through all of these, but you look very quickly at what happened at that facility where we assessed all the animals and their causes of death and so on. In fact, we published all this in the Journal of Animal Welfare Science. There was so much data and we wanted it to be out there. But you can see, if you're looking at invertebrates, for instance, those were the total numbers of animals, that there were 2,274 invertebrates. Those were the number of mortalities, and 18%, which made 18%. It came to the reptiles cumulatively. Here were the numbers, here were the mortalities, and here were the mortality rates. Well, these are quite shocking numbers, and they're quite shocking numbers. And what's more, this was just within 10 days. And these were within the 10 days that the expert exotic pet vets and myself and the rest of them had rescued them. And you might think, well, you weren't doing much better either. Well, one of the problems is because of all the stresses and strains and pathogenic exposures that these animals have had over the previous 6 weeks can't be just cleaned up in a day or even 10 days. So you have a lag phase between when the traumas are applying to the animals, the stresses are applying to these animals. There's a lag phase between that and actually trying to pull them out of those conditions. And this gives you an example, really, of the kinds of causes that were associated with this mortality rate. Not easy to see. You don't have to see them all, but all you need to kind of realize is these numbers correspond to these keys. For instance, trauma is number 1, infection 2, dehydration 3, and it goes right the way down. And you can see how many different types of causes were associated with the mortalities and morbidities of those animals that were rescued from this facility. So what does all that mean? Because these are numbers, and numbers are just numbers. And will you remember them? No, you'll probably remember the pictures, though. Because everywhere we went round this facility, there were small bins. Oh, no, they said to me to use the term trash cans. Is that right? Trash cans of dead animals. Not all of them dead, as we'll see. And the reason there were so many of these small trash cans was because the numbers of animals that had to be pulled out of the cages dead and dying were so many that they couldn't run down to one bin and do it. They had to pile them up and then gradually accumulate them all towards the end of the day. But they were everywhere we looked. This is a bag containing baby turtles, bigger turtles. There were other animals in there, frogs. There's a dead amphibian, newt. And they weren't all dead. So we had to go through every single bag in the main trash bin outside, which was a huge container, pull them all out, pull every animal out of the cage that we thought was dead or they thought was dead, and go through them all again and assess them in detail. And here's an example, a rather blatant example, of where they simply weren't even dead within the trash cans. This is a little frog. No particular reason we could find why he was in there, but he was thrown away. And this is a snake that we guessed at the time was probably suffering from inclusion body disease, which is a viral infection that's being passed around the trade, by the trade, and it's getting into zoo animals, and it's a major problem. Just in the rubbish bin. Little rodent in the rubbish bin, emaciated, sick. In fact, almost all these bins had some animals in them. Invertebrates, all in the rubbish bins, rubbish trash cans, Clifford. Here's an example of not the snake we took from the bin, but the same kind, which has a nasty disease called necrotic stomatitis, a pus in its mouth and down its throat, and it gets into the lungs and had to be euthanized. When it comes to the small rodents have a high dietary intake requirement. They eat all the time, and if they can't eat the good food that they're supposed to be given, they'll eat each other, especially under high-stress environments. And so cannibalism was something of an outbreak, an epidemic at this particular facility. We could find them cannibalized and desiccated almost everywhere that we would go. Huge numbers of them. In this case, this is full of, you can see there's a scorpion there, and they're nearly all scorpions and spiders, save us for those two turtles. Just one of the many bins littered around waiting to go out and fill the main trash can. And another snake with an infection in its mouth where the skin has reflected back and exposed the bones. There was just hundreds and hundreds of cases like this. Now, hedgehogs, of course, when they're attacked, can roll their limbs into the body, but they can't do it all day, so eventually they expose it, something gets hold of it, and you end up with a nasty injury, a nasty lesion like this. Lots of those. This is a sick sloth, very sick sloth. Managed to pull him through, though, the team did. Wasn't my department, but they did great stuff and pulled him through. But he was actually sitting there ready to be sold in this condition. What do you think is in here? Well, you couldn't tell from that distance, but look a little closer. Frogs. This is how typically frogs are transported, tree frogs, because they think they're protecting them from impacts with others. But as you can see, climbing up here is an indication they don't want to be in there. And it gets dirty, and skin on frogs is very sensitive, easily damaged, and gets infections in very easily indeed. Typical way to transport them in the pet trade. You don't need to be an expert to realize that this kind of environment with all this water on it here, this filthy mess, this bacterial soup, is not good. It's not good at all. And I dare say most of you know that the backstroke isn't a favorite habit of the terrapin, of the turtle. That's a sick animal. Most of them were in bad shape. And yet these were still waiting there, ready for sale. These are royal pythons, sometimes called ball pythons, because their defensive behavior is to stick their head inside the coils of their body, roll up in a little ball. And superficially, you might say, well, you know, the bedding doesn't look so bad. It looks kind of clean. They don't seem to be in any real state of emergency. Well, it's not quite as it appears, because as these are secretive animals, they tend to try and get into clusters, and then this one wants to get underneath, and sooner or later, they're squashed under there, flattened under there, can't get out. So it's no good just giving large areas of space. Not that that was a particularly large area of space. But the problem is they will go in a corner and try and get underneath that, and they will effectively end up being crushed and suffocated in their hundreds. Because these were the freezers that we opened up on this facility, and they were jam-packed with a whole menagerie of dead frozen animals, many of which were simply blocks of these dead snakes. You might think, well, why on earth does this business operate with such vast wastage? Well, it's quite simple. They're cheap. When it came to the hamsters that they were selling, and the mortality rates were through the roof, they were paying 1 cent per hamster and importing 4,000 of them a month. We were looking round for the food and we couldn't find it anywhere. Where's the food? So we don't buy the food. Because at a cent a hamster, a 50-cent pack of food wrecks the profit margin. We just hope to sell them quickly. And besides, they eat each other when they get hungry. There were lots of ways of transporting animals. In this particular case, we stumbled across these boxes that had been sitting there for 2 weeks waiting for shipment. 2 weeks waiting for shipment. Well, what could be in these boxes? Being trapped inside a box for a wild animal, and bear in mind that no matter what your local pet store or hobbyist or so-called herpetologist expert probably holds down a job as a window cleaner during the day, but mysteriously becomes a world authority on reptiles after 6 o'clock and at weekends, that sort of person, if you try and explain to them that reptiles are wild animals, they'll say, no, they're domesticated. Forget it. They're not domesticated. They're wild. Same thing applies to almost all the pets in the exotic fraternity. So now you're a trapped wild animal in a box. You've been handled by what you probably perceived as a predator, because how many other animals come up and handle animals in nature? They handle them if they're going to eat you. So you've been handled, and now you're not only in a box, but you're in a bag. And in that bag, or those bags, were 414 green iguanas, destined for Turkey, I think, or it could be Egypt. 50% of them, lying dead here on the floor, were casualties. Hardly surprising, given that they're in those conditions. And of course, these won't show up on any of the dealers' data because they'll simply be binned, and the live ones would be the ones that make it into the market. And here's a vet on the left, and myself, or at least a bit of me, there's more to me than just a hand, going through the animals from the bins and finding the live from the dead. Laborious process when you're trying to assess consciousness in tiny, weeny, sick animals. But we spent hours and hours doing just that and euthanizing many others. Another example of the animals that we were pulling from the bins dead and pulling from the cages dead. These are all the confirmed dead from one section. And you might think, well, Is Cliff just picking on this one bad apple in an otherwise good bunch? Wrong. Because 1 year later, we were doing exactly the same thing in yet another huge breeding facility. This one had 70 species of reptile and rodent. They often vary. Some will do fish, some will do birds, some will do birds and amphibians, some will do amphibians and reptiles and so on. This did reptiles and reptiles and rodents. 16,500 animals there, 600 of which were reptiles. Here are some of the conditions in which they were kept. It all looks rather familiar. I haven't put them all in because they're basically very similar to the ones I've just showed you. Filthy conditions. The only people doing any cleaning in this facility were the maggots, which you can see are down here. If anyone knows what a boa constrictor is supposed to look like, this is it. This is what it is, but this isn't what it's supposed to look like. They're supposed to be big, chunky animals. It's an albinistic one, meaning it's not got all the color that a typical one would have, but this is one seriously emaciated animal. Dead ones in the bins. You're beginning to put the picture together. It's the same story wherever you go. And let's leave aside North America, which is riddled with these kind of conditions. This is basically the norm, remember, 70% is normal mortality rate in 6 weeks for wholesalers. Let's go back just 2 months. Just 2 months ago, there was a huge organized raid of 15 breeders and dealers in Europe, including the dealer that was supplying the 4,000 hamsters to that other place every month. And of the 15 dealers that were raided, 11 of them were found to be so bad that they were in prosecutable condition. These were major suppliers to Europe and beyond. And here are just a couple of glimpses, yet again, of what was going on down in the basements. These are birds kept in the dark in the basements, loomed down. Birds do not want to be on the floor when we as a potential predator are stalking around. But yet they were. Things like behavioral considerations scarcely come into it. If they can apply enough food and water in them to keep them alive for a little while, just long enough to sell them, that's good enough as far as the trade's concerned. No way to keep a bird. These animals are long dead. They'd been in a drawer, couldn't be bothered to bring them out. Exactly what the cause of death was hard to know. You might surmise that this one's been caught in the drawer and simply killed. Possibly, but it was there along with many others. Nobody even bothered to remove it. And that means there's a huge opportunity for pathogen transmission. You don't analyze what caused the death in these animals. You think that there's CSI wandering around. You think that they even call in the local vet and say, tell me what was the problem so I can see what outbreak of disease I may be facing. No. It goes in the bin. Or just gets left in the drawer. Guinea pigs in dark basements, waiting shipment. This is in Hawaii, because Hawaii has this horrendous problem with fish. Pet fish are shipped out of Hawaii like beans. These are just a tiny fraction of the numbers that die. And Hawaii has something like a 90 to 98% mortality rate amongst its fish before they've even been put in the dealers' yards. The capture process kills that many. And then we have very high 80 to 90% mortality rates at the dealers' yards, and we have a 95% mortality rate when they reach the home. If you're a fish caught by the pet trade from the wild, and you manage to get through and survive, you better hope that they bring out a fish lottery, because you're going to win it. Now, one of the things that's often put forward as some kind of panacea to the problems of the wild-caught fish and the wild-caught reptiles, which is a massive problem, and nobody should ever be under any illusions that catching them wild is a horrendous process. But the idea that captive breeding can somehow cure all this is another nonsense on the nonsense. Captive breeding means essentially keeping animals under highly intensive conditions, and you will hear herpetologists telling you they won't breed unless they're under high quality conditions. We'll come back to that later on, because I can tell you now that that claim is false. They breed under these conditions very successfully. These are reptiles. You can't even see them because they're hiding at the back. Not very surprising, given that they don't have much of an environment. You'll hear almost ad infinitum from the pseudo-experts in the reptile world and the hobbyist world that, well, you must have UVB. Yes, you must have UVB for many of these species. You've got to have appropriate light and heat. They need good gradients. Really? In that? Where are the opportunities to put a nice, safely positioned light bulb and a good temperature gradient in that, where they can avoid the light and get the warmth? It's not in there. That's why they can't put them in. It's too small. These are Tupperware containers, essentially, and you might put your lunch in it, but it's not the sort of place to put an animal in. More of the same, different type of boxes, but principles the same. Animals trapped. These are snakes trapped in hundreds of boxes, which will go on for meters and meters. This is where a lot of the captive bred stock comes from that's been supposedly so well looked after. Look round the back, and it's the familiar story of the animals dead in the bins. In this case, these are rodents. In fact, those very rodent breeders I was telling you about in Europe that got busted 2 months ago. Dark, dingy conditions. We're well aware that rats will go down into dark environments, but force rats into dark environments like this, and they don't like it. Birds. Because birds, believe it or not, are also produced for the pet trade. Many of them are wild caught, of course, and that is terrible. They use bird lime and nets and all sorts of things that do horrible things to the birds in order to trap them. And Anthony, who will be on later on, will tell you a whole load more about birds than I can ever tell you. But I've borrowed this slide from a colleague of mine who's actually a parrot behaviorist. He spends a lot of his time just trying to unravel the minds, the disturbed minds of parrots that have been made disturbed by the people who bred and kept them. I'm not saying that the people who kept them did that maliciously. If you don't understand the animal, you can really spoil its mental processes. And this is just a glimpse into the way in which these birds are produced. They're often force-fed, not far off something you might describe as a factory line. So now you have young birds that really are highly impressionable. We probably most know about imprinting and how birds will effectively be highly influenced by the environment in which and the individuals with which they are first exposed, and these birds are being exposed to people who are in effect abusing them. They're force-feeding them, they're manhandling them, and so their early life formative experiences are pretty dreadful. No normal bird, no normal socialization process they would go through of their own kind, but they have a different species abusing it. Is it any wonder that once they get out there into the real world, they have problems? Now, these may seem like really basic points to make, and they are. They are. But they're so basic that how many of them, basic requirements though they be, how many of them do you really think the typical pet dealer and pet keeper is fulfilling? Now, you can pick almost any animal in your mind and run through this list, and I'm not going to go through individually because you'll get the gist of what it's about. These are things that these animals typically do. Reptiles swim, walk, climb, jump, burrow. Mammals run, jump. You know, there's a commonality. Some things are slightly different. An invertebrate will do virtually the whole lot. But what opportunities do they really have to do those in the environments you see? And people will say they don't need them because they don't have to find food. Nonsense. Finding food is one of the things that these animals are genetically, biologically geared up to do in their own way. Same thing with space. They need space. Space is associated with the way they acquire their foods and many other things. So cages can never supplement for these the opportunities that these animals to do all these things, and they of course do rafts of things more, so many more things, complex subtleties. A couple of really basic physical points as well that some people overlook. Fundamentally, there is no difference between the pain perception mechanisms of the lowest animals that we can assess and ourselves. You can pretty much bet that whether it is a frog or a fish or a lobster or a reptile or a crustacean or a bird or a mammal, that it will have a pain perception mechanism. And the more that neurologists and physiologists look into this, the more they discover. Just because something may not have the same kind of centralized nervous system that we have does not mean it doesn't feel pain. Approach a lobster with a blowtorch underwater, and it moves away from you. If it liked it so much, it would approach it, sun itself, cook itself. It doesn't, it moves away. So pain perception is something that is normal, and it's there. Now, the complex nutritional requirements of animals is something that we can never overlook. And I mention this because I'm not thinking in terms of the people in the pet trade and the hobbyists that are quite low down the tree when it comes to knowledge. I'm talking about even if you think of some of the highest level experts in the world. I was working on a book some years ago, and I wanted to bring in the most modern concepts. And so I was bringing in experts from all over the world. In fact, I think we surveyed about 300 experts, and we got 20 that we were happy to use. And one of the expert nutritionists in that, who's a genuine expert, very highly qualified person, had just not thought of one thing. He had categorized the animals as carnivores, omnivores, and vegetarians. Sounds perfectly sensible. But I was having a discussion with him and said, well, don't you think it's important that the snake, when it eats the rabbit, is eating all the vegetation that the rabbit's eaten? So he's thinking, well, from a micronutrients point, that's very important. And nowadays, there's a lot of discussion around micronutrients. Whether or not it's essential isn't the issue. The fact that it happens means we shouldn't presume that it's not important. And so instead of a snake being a carnivore, it's an intentional carnivore and an incidental omnivore. And the same can be said of the vegetarians. Intentionally vegetarian, the cows are not trying to eat the slugs and the snails and the spiders that dwell within the grass, but because they hoover up so much grass, they inevitably eat a load of slugs and snails. And so some of that protein potentially is important. And we should think about these micronutrients. And those are things that the animals would be doing in their own natural setting that people would not automatically be doing in captivity. Taking in water, for instance, amongst many animals is something that's not just a case of drinking from a bowl or from a pool. But they may only get their water through mist that gathers on their bodies and it runs down their bodies to their lips and then they suck it. Others may actually get their water through the food. And this is one of the reasons, for instance, why food quality is really important. A number of my colleagues and I try to push forward this point that if you happen to be an inspector or working anywhere in a zoo, a pet shop, whatever the facility, a private home, and you happen to see that the way they're looking after the invertebrates is poor, it reminds me of that expression that Mahatma Gandhi said, which is that you can judge the greatness of a nation by the way it treats its animals. In other words, if they treat the lowest part of their community well, then everything else should be pretty good. And so if someone's not looking after the mealworms, or the hawk moth larvae, or the cockroaches and crickets that they feed to the others, then they're not probably paying enough attention to everything else further up the pipeline. I'm not saying in evolutionary terms, just how the practical systems are working. And that tells you two things. One, there is welfare at the heart of these invertebrates. These animals have their own welfare needs, even if it's a bug. And the second thing is, a dehydrated, poorly cared for grub has less water. So if an animal's dependent on it for its water supply, it's not going to get the kind of water supply that it needs. And temperature is so important, especially for the ectotherms. Those are the reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates, for instance. When we think about our body temperatures, you probably don't realize that your body's doing it for you. It's adjusting your temperature at the micro level all the time, part of a degree, 1 degree. Your temperature goes up by a couple of degrees, you start to feel pretty rotten, feverish. Whole part of a complex biological strategy I don't have time to go into, but it's there to serve you. Fever is an aid. It's a process that's been evolved over millions of years to help you through a problem. Raises your immune system, makes it more difficult for bugs to invade, all sorts of things. 1 degree change in temperature can change a whole clutch of reptile eggs from male to female. And a reptile's natural thermal range, depending on the species, could be from 20 Celsius to 40 Celsius. And it will need to pick those temperatures at the time that it feels is right. You can't just force it on him. If you were put into a room, which was a boiling hot room right now, you'd probably feel quite uncomfortable. Be sick, and that fever will be helping you out. You don't want to impose conditions on animals that are not appropriate for them, but that's exactly what people who husband these animals do. They set the temperature according to what they think it should be because they've read a pamphlet by some guy called Sid, and he's probably got it right because he keeps a lot of reptiles. Don't believe a word of it. Rest and sleep is so important. I put it down, I mean, it's so obvious. If you didn't have a bad day, you might need less sleep. If you've had a really bad day, you'll want more sleep. You'll need it for recovery. It's very important for our immune systems, our health and everything. Deprive you of a couple of days of sleep and you will feel pretty rotten. Deprive you of a couple of weeks of it and you'll probably be in critical condition or dead. It's a very important thing. And how can these animals get rest and sleep in an environment that's laden with stresses, few opportunities for relief and quiescence and stabilization? And even in the case of many species, we will have a light source that's also a heat source. So how does a nocturnal animal get away from that? Now, there are ways of doing it, but many people don't see it. And many of these animals that are wanting to avoid the light can't because the environment is simply too small, and they may simply want to choose an area of seclusion that isn't like the one that you thought they need. And this leads on to the whole space issue. Because when you think about dogs and cats have, broadly speaking, a very good association with you. Lots of reasons why dogs and cats can make good companion animals. And that leaves nearly all the exotics in another category. Just think about dogs and cats for a minute. How many of you, if you don't have to show hands or anything, but how many of you have had a situation where the dog grabs the lead, comes to you and says, look, I think it's time for my walk? It happens a lot. Who's running the show here? Well, the dog or me? Well, the thing is, you're part of his family, he's part of yours. And he can go out and come back in pretty much as he pleases. How does that happen for a snake or a tortoise or a turtle or a lizard or a bird that's in something this big? And these are animals that would cover frequently far greater areas than a dog or a cat would. Far greater areas. But in the reptile world, there's this bizarre thinking. They don't need space. The best little anecdote from it all is this whole notion that they come up with, which is, oh no, snakes are agoraphobic. Agoraphobic is a human condition, a problem that your psychologist or psychiatrist will deal with. Snakes don't have agoraphobia. If you hear that, it's just like one of the many words that reptile biologists, herpetologists, probably with no qualifications, but some do have them, and some even vets with diplomas will say they don't need the space. But these kind of words, agoraphobia, along with so many other justifications for keeping them in captivity, are terms that they pull out of a hat and that basically expose that they don't know anything about it. So thermal needs are very important, and gradation is so important. You can't have a temperature gradation between here and here that's more than a degree or so. That's not enough. That's not enough. You might be able to get a reasonable gradation between here and there, 20 feet away, 6 meters away, but you're not going to be able to get that in a small environment. So automatically their thermal needs are compromised, and then they're being preset by people who really don't know what the temperatures should be because they're taking guesses made out of really poorly constructed books. The issue of light invasiveness I've covered, but it's a big issue. A lot of these animals are surrounded by light, just like hamsters will often be asleep during the day, and people are trying to poke them up, which is effectively the middle of their night. And this kind of thing goes on with leopard geckos in reptile cases and others. These temperatures are not achievable in a classic vivarium that you see. I wanted to look at a couple of things about overcrowding, some of the obvious things and subtle things. Because to many people, they'll see what's very obvious, but not what's not so obvious. Now, I'm not saying that any conditions in which these animals are kept in captivity are acceptable. There's only one place for these kind of exotic animals, and it's in the wild. So everything that I'm showing you, no matter when I say that's a better condition than that, I'm meaning it's a compromised condition, very compromised condition, but it may be the difference between a small prison cell and a bigger prison cell. But these are these ball pythons again, and I use them quite a bit because they're common in trade. And you can see here's one doing exactly the behavior I said earlier on, tucking its head inside the balls of coils. But it's obviously overcrowded. Anyone can see it's overcrowded. Here we have that bunching effect where there are undoubtedly dead ones underneath, and we would have pulled them out at the time. So that's overcrowding, what we call overt overcrowding, because it's so obvious. Overcrowded or what? Yeah, you betcha. That's overcrowded, all right. Well, obvious. But what about this, you see? Slightly more subtle. There's plenty of space here. A couple of turtles here, some down here under the water, quite a few of them. The light bulb that services their heat needs is here. This is one of these sort of semi-floating logs. But this is an example of what we call crypto-overcrowding. And what that means is that all of the turtles that are in here cannot use every facility at any one time. So, in this case, they can't all get on to bask, sun themselves, which is essential for these animals to do when they want to do it. They can't all get on to bask, even though there's more space around. So it's overcrowded. Even if there was an acre of a lake, if the only basking space was this, it would still be overcrowded because the facility simply can't provide everything that they need at any time. And you must bear in mind always that they need to choose what they want at their behest, not yours. Here's another example, again using those same pythons. There are 4 pythons in here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, they're not squashed to the point where they're crushing each other. But you've noticed there's space around here, not a lot, but there's space around here and they're not using it. And the mindset of a regular reptile keeper or hobbyist would be, well, there's plenty of space, see? They're not even using it all. Thing was, all of them wanted to use the water for whatever reason at that particular time. And in order to do so, they had to squash themselves into it. So it's crypto-overcrowded. There's not enough space for them to do everything they want at the same time. Same thing with the food bowl. If they can't all get around a food bowl at exactly the same time, it's overcrowded. So that's a subtle distinction, but an important one. This is an example of what we call restricted by provision, which means it doesn't matter how big the cage is. These are animals that have very high thermal needs. They may go down quite cool because they live in the Australian desert, may go down quite cool at night, but during the day, and when they choose, they want to get to hot temperatures at a time that's right for them. But the problem is that the rest of the cage is nearly always quite cool. In fact, it was, I think, down in the low 20s on the left and up in the high 30s over here. And so they're effectively going to the part of the environment that they feel most familiar with. And that restricts them by provision. It's no good the cage just saying I've given them lots of space if the only part that they feel comfortable in is that tiny little bit. Now this is a sort of positive one, because I did a trip round a facility in Newmarket that I can certainly say was putting in a lot more effort. It was actually a small zoo, but they're putting in a lot more effort towards the behavioral needs and spatial needs of reptiles and amphibians than I would see in many other facilities, and I'd give them a lot of credit for that. They had a lot of things that were wrong and that I would give them a long advice list for, but at least you could sort of get their thinking was on the right track. Green mambas, famous mambas, up in a very green environment, because that's where they kind of live, little caricature of where they would live in nature. Makes sense, they're green for a reason. Well, it's all gone wrong, isn't it? Not only are these environments ridiculously small, but it's a brown environment with a green animal in it. That is an absolute red flag that this person has zero clue as to what they're doing. And stresses and traumas in captivity can all have cumulative effects. If you get dehydrated, poorly fed, cold, miserable, sad, under pressure, you are more likely to succumb to diseases. And so the captivity stress, malnutrition, bad thermal temperatures and so on, they all add up, and then it presents as debilitation, disease, and in this case this lizard was actually dead, just hanging on a tree. And then you walk into your veterinarian and say, well, fix it for me. You say, I can't. I'm not a magician. I can only do so much. You've brought me the end result of a tale of woe that's gone back not just from what you've done with it, but what the trade did with it before, and to which we've had a glance today. I want to just look at a couple of these common causes that we see, and there are hundreds of them. This is a lizard that normally lives high up in the tree canopy. And what it's doing here is basking under a light. But its face is pretty obviously busted up, we can see all that. Now there's another cause for this kind of lesion, and we'll come to that later on. But in this case, what had happened is this guy did what he would normally do in nature, a normal behavior with a catastrophic result because he's in a cage. And what it is that when they get disturbed, they jump down from the trees, anticipating that there will be some deep leaf litter on the floor or water. Not a concrete cage with a tiny smattering of bark. And so they bust their face up, the lesion becomes worse as infection sets in, and they lose most of their mouth and the jaw, their snout, and it will never grow back. Vets around the US, UK, the world are familiar with this, which is metabolic bone disease. Very, very debilitating, high mortality rate, and all down really to the fact that people can't get the right balance of nutrients into these animals. It doesn't happen to everyone, but it happens to an awful lot. People think they need calcium. The guy in the pet shop says you need calcium. You can't just give them calcium. Calcium needs phosphorus in the balance. Phosphorus needs vitamin D. Can't absorb all that without good temperatures. Water quality has to be good. Water quantity has to be good. Humidity. All these things compound to give you a state to which metabolic bone disease shouldn't take place. But there are so many compounding factors that need to be fixed in the right order. This is an open invitation for metabolic bone disease and, frankly, hundreds of other diseases that affect these animals. This is another picture that I took from my trips for one of the other presentations. And what we have is not a very good picture, but it's more for journalistic, illustrative purposes, let's say. That masks my inability to take a good picture, so we'll just leave it at that. This here is a large Asian water monitor. These are big, hefty monitors, and they have big bodies that need a lot of heat. Now, the background temperature of this facility down here was nothing critically low, but it was pretty low. And it's fine to have a cool area because we've talked about this whole notion of temperature grades. But when it comes to him wanting the hot spot, he has 2 bulbs and a 6-foot-long body. It's a big lizard. Nothing like as big as they can get, but he's still a big lizard. But he can't heat his whole body under those 2 lights because he's 6 feet long and they're about 20 centimeters each across. So he gets closer and closer and closer until part of him is very close to the light bulbs, and they are accessible and he can reach them. The next thing is he gets a rather serious burn. And it's very, very, I'm not saying he did, but this is what commonly happens. They get serious burns. Here's another example where this American alligator, here are the two heat sources, or three, but then you can see the line. How much of his body do they cover? Maybe 50% of it. Well, when these animals bask out in the wild, they don't go out and there's a small spotlight of sun. It seems to be all, I don't know whether you've noticed that, but I go out on a sunny day and it tends to be all around. Not in one little spot and people trying to crowd under it. You can put a foot at a time and get a suntan. It doesn't work that way. But in this case, this guy can't heat his whole body at one time. And here are some of the consequences of all that. These are thermal burns. When I say thermal burns, people say, what other kind of burn are there? Well, there's friction burns, chemical burns, but these are thermal burns. Pretty obvious. And what has happened in his case is that somebody had these hot rocks on the bed of their tank. Nightmare hot rocks. Can be used only very, very sparingly, and even then, not a terribly good idea. They're used, or supposed to be used, for thigmotherms, those that get most of their heat from the ground. But they're frankly too hot too much of the time. But even if there's a bulb that's too low and it's hot, and these animals can't heat themselves properly, they go and burn themselves. Now you think back to the pain perception thing, and you might more likely to think, well, why did he just burn himself? Well, the problem is that they get close, and gradually the nerve cells, the ends of the nerves, get desensitized. So then they get closer and they touch the bulb and they're not feeling it burning until it's too late. Now this was taken again just at this facility the other day, which I would have given a very high rating to compared with many other zoos and many pet shops that I see, because it was also a pet shop. But if you look here and here, these are burns on this albinistic python. And the picture's just, because it was taken on a mobile phone, simply not good enough to show, but this is a burn here as well on this other python. It's the same species, just darker. And these burns are common, and people who are claiming to be experts are still making these fundamental errors. These are such basic errors, but they're still making them. A co-occupant aggression is an example of where a behavior also becomes a clinical problem. You go to see the behaviorist for the behavior problem, you see the vet for the veterinary problem, but this involves both. Because this lizard has been in with another one that's, for whatever reason, competition over space or whatever, has decided to take a bite here. It's a subtle distinction because some lizards have chunky faces and you can't always tell that they've been bitten. So you need to know the species to know that it's actually got an abscess. It might not be symmetrical by both sides, but he could have been bitten both sides too. So you present at the vet and you say, do something about it. Well, this is a big problem because this isn't just as simple as lancing an abscess on a dog's foot, which can have its own complications. But abscesses in reptiles have nearly always brewed for a very long time. And so the material that comes out is anything from toothpaste typically to hard cheese. And they're very difficult to cleanse, very difficult to get out, and they can spread throughout the body. It's like a liquid cancer, and many of them don't survive it, all because of one little bite, co-occupant aggression, which we'll return to maybe a little bit later on. Now, this is an important area because whilst I've talked about pain perception a little bit, and you'll remember the similarities between all these animals, that we can basically regard all animals as feeling pain, even if we can't for sure say they do, we should presume they do because there's reasonable evidence to suggest they do. How many people would have thought reptiles do problem solving? Initially you'd be thinking, well, maybe my dog thinks, this is what people used to think, anyone who's close to their dog knows full well it thinks. And the science will show you it thinks. I can't believe that sometimes we have a biologist or some PhD saying, well, maybe the dog's conscious. I think, well, the dog probably is, but I'm not so sure about the lecturer. So they're all going to be conscious, and there are masses of material on all this that I'm going to show you a glimpse of. But reptiles will solve problems. They'll use buttons to get food. Give them rings and balls to play with, they'll do it. Now I'm not condoning that that's a great thing, because it's a bit like having to give animals things to play with at SeaWorld. I don't think the animals are happy, but they'll use the tools that are around them to amuse themselves. But they do express play, and it's just an example of hello, this is sounding a bit more like the animals I do know are quite sensitive. And their memory is great. Don't believe any of this nonsense. Goldfish goes around the bowl, it's forgotten it went round first time, so it's happy in there. Goldfish is miserable as miserable in that. But their memory is so good that year on year they can come out and remember where they found the food last time, and the best food. And if that food happens to have moved, they'll be looking around for it. Their memories are good. As far as we know, they're permanent. Their memories are going to be, from what we can tell, just as good as ours, frankly. And such things as eye contact, they're so sensitive to interactions that they will remember who was the threat. And there's been work done to show that even scientists benignly trying to study the behavior of lizards have entirely disrupted their perching arrangements where the hierarchies had been set through dominance behaviors and whatever, just because they made eye contact with the lead male, and that's upset him. I wanted to give you a little quick guide as to just how much this subject has grown, and why many years ago you could have said, yeah, well, Cliff, that's your opinion, and yeah, you know, who cares? Fair enough. But I wrote what was probably the first paper on reptile captivity stress-related problems in 1990, when I was about 3. The important bit is not what I said, because as usual I'm probably talking a load of old garbage. At least that's what they'll say on the internet. But it was this reference list. It's tiny. I mean, it's a tiny reference list by anybody's standards. I didn't just not read up, and I didn't just not care. It took weeks and weeks of searching to come up with this tiny little list of only partially relevant information from scanning all over the world, because there was virtually nothing out there that I could even piece together to support the arguments I was making about the research that I'd done. That was 1990. This is a paper in the very same journal in 2013. In fact, it's only about 14 months old. By Gordon Berghart, colleague of mine, works in a very similar area of reptile biology and behavior to I do. And this is his reference list. Now, he produces loads of papers, as I do. I churn out quite a few. And this is just an example of the references. There are 137. I had about 6 at that time. And this isn't because he's just found them. It's because these indicate the level of scientific interest that there is in the cognitive capacities of reptiles, fish, mammals, birds, and so on. And these are all about reptiles and amphibians, just on reptiles and amphibians. So you can see that there's a huge swell of interest in these formerly thought of as scientifically soft areas, the minds of reptiles, amphibians, and other animals. Now, it might seem obvious to those of you who have not been caught up in any of the reptile trade type keeping hobby lobby business that this is a snake, a rather large water python or reticulated python, and it's stretching out. Well, snakes do tend to be described as long animals, which they are. But it's stretching out because it wants to stretch out. This was taken just a couple of days ago. The other one was years old. This was taken a couple of days ago when I visited a place in, I think it was Newmarket. And again, you can see one of the things to the credit of that facility is that in every single environment that I could see where they had snakes, the snake could stretch out to its fullest. Now, that's not saying that it's giving them natural conditions, but at least it can stretch out. If you had to walk around in a building like this, you'd think something's wrong. But this simple message is very difficult to get through to people who keep these animals. They say, no, they like to sit coiled up. Well, you're sitting down now, but if I said, that's fine, that's it, we'll drop the ceiling, That's how it's going to be from now on, boys. You don't get up anymore. No, you may want to sit coiled. But I was only in there for about half an hour, and there were plenty of snakes that were going along, stretching themselves out for the very reason that they could. What can this guy do about that? Nothing. Snakes need to stretch out, and they need to stretch out when they want to stretch out. There are maybe physiological reasons to do with digestion, perhaps just comfort. But they want to do it, and they need to do it. Any cage in which a snake cannot stretch out fully, snake shouldn't be in it. And I'm not saying it should be in the cage, but I think you get the picture. And in fact, behavior problems in reptiles go on and on and on. When I show this to vets who've done special diplomas in exotic reptile medicine, and they say, well, now we're the cream of the cream, and I say, well, really, how many of the behaviors that relate to captivity stress in reptiles do you think you can name? Because I can assure you, if I were to ask the same question of most vets about a dog, they'll give you a whole list of things to look out for that might indicate stress in the dog. And they scratch their head and they'll say something like, maybe it doesn't eat? Eat? The list of known behavioral problems associated with captivity stress in reptiles is long. And that's only half of it, because it's the other half. And we're adding to these all the time. And nearly always the causes are too small environments, poor temperatures, people handling them, things that are not resolvable, frankly, in captivity. You can't fix the problem of captivity stress in captivity. There are some positive signs, and we always say to people, look out for these. But nearly always they come back and they say, I don't see many of those. They're there, but you don't see many of them. These are the positive signs. And to take just a couple, because as you can see it's a long list, to take just a couple of those behaviors that were on that list and explain a little bit more about them. One is what we call hyperactivity. Now that hyperactivity, too much activity, just basically really means there's a lot of activity that seems to be out of context. Hyperactivity is normal for an athlete. It's not very normal for me, running around. No. But it seems to be associated with exploratory and search behaviors. So if they're hyperactive, it generally tells you they're looking for something and it's not in there. It's not in that cage. That often ties in with what we call interaction with transparent boundaries. Nowadays, other people use terms like wall walking and snout rubbing, where you see the animal's got his snout on the glass all the time. And essentially, it wants out, and it's gone to the clear section of the tank thinking it can get out. And this is a major problem for reptiles. This is a major stress sign. If you see this, and you see it in virtually every animal, in virtually every pet shop, every collector's home, and every zoo, it's a major sign of stress. And what it essentially relates to is this. Reptiles are innately educated. We're all partly innately educated, but they're very strongly innately educated, what we call hardwired, whereas we and many other animals are soft-wired. We have more flexibility. So from birth, many animals get the parental education, the tips they need to help them through their lifespans. They learn from the parents where the good things are, where the bad things are. Reptiles are straight out of the egg and they're off. They can find food, shelter, defend themselves, everything but reproduce immediately. And that's because their genetics are already imbued with these facilities. And that means that when they're in captivity, it's very easily, arguably, worse for them to be faced with such a situation because they have needs that have been preset very hard versus the slightly softer needs of animals that are more adaptable because they will learn more from their environments as they go. They will learn more from their parents and from experiences and so on that are within a community. They don't quite have that. So when they come up against glass, unlike a cat that will often walk up to a glass barrier, test it a little bit and realize, oh, can't get through there. I'll go find another place. For them, they think it's invisible. I should be able to go through it. And so a vast proportion of their time will often be focused on the glass area. And you can mask it with tape, as many zoos say. What do? I think I'll mask it with tape so that it can't see out. But because they have good memories, they remember that's where they thought they could get out before. And the only way really to part solve it is to take them from that environment into a wholly new, much more spacious environment with no transparent boundaries. And then you often have to take little chemical cues with them as well. Maybe a tiny smear of feces or something, so that they have that familiar chemical cue and they don't feel that they've been put into a hostile environment at the same time. Major problem. And it's everywhere. This again was the facility 2 days ago. This is an iguana walking up and down the glass. He does it so much, in fact, trying to get through the glass. I don't know if you can make it out, but the entire lower portion of the glass here is misty. And it's misty because those are the lines that have been left behind, the detritus of where his snout has been rubbing backwards and forwards. And sometimes those snouts get so raw that they end up looking like the lizard that had jumped off the tree and busted up its snout. Same lizard, you can see what he's doing. He's got, by many people's standards, they would, I would have to say, they've given them a lot of space, qualified use of the word space, because he can run around there if he wants pretty well. Why isn't he so happy in there then that he doesn't want to get out? Because no matter how much space you give them, they want to get out. Reptiles have spatial ranges that range from kilometers to hundreds of kilometers. So even a large cage, it's like a large room to you, perhaps. Here's another example, same facility. You can see the same murky the glass here. This is a monitor lizard, different lizard, backwards and forwards, rubbing his snout against the glass. He's not doing it against the hard wall. It's only the glass, because he thinks he can get through it. Snake doing the same, turtle doing the same. You don't see the lines, of course, because it's underwater and it gets cleaned away. Now, the opposite of hyperactivity and all that is hypoactivity, which is to say, again, within its context, less activity than you'd expect. Way more difficult to diagnose because you may have to hang around the animal for weeks to know whether or not it's genuinely hypoactive or whether it's in some kind of estivative or brumative or hibernative state, many of which can be artificially influenced by the poor temperatures and environment around it. But the difficulty here is that whereas in the species that tend to go through exploratory patterns where they want to avoid an environment by getting out of it, a bit like when a pond dries up and the alligators get up and they want to walk away from it, they're avoiding that environment by escaping it, searching it. In the case of sedentary behavior, hypoactivity, it's often found in animals that decide they're going to try and wait out the conditions, like hibernation. Problem is, these conditions will never go away. So they become hypoactive. And to the typical herpetologist, you'll say, oh, there you are, told you. They're sedentary animals. They don't move around much. Well, they don't move around much because they're psychologically bedbound. Now, this was an example of another behavior that we had, which is called pico, and it's where animals tend to pick up and consume items that they really shouldn't, and at least they shouldn't in those volumes. And it's thought to be related to understimulation, and in this case it was because some smart-ass pet dealer decided to sell a turtle kit or tortoise kit, complete with the animal and all the trimmings that they thought it needed in a tank this size. Within no time at all, the tortoise is understimulated. In the common tongue, I don't like to use this in scientific circles, but bored, as you might think of it. And so what might otherwise be a semi-natural behavior, or a natural one of picking up stones occasionally and aiding in digestive processes, they take to becoming obsessed with it. And this guy had 120 stones in his gut. And you can see, but these are centimeters, you can see how big some of these were. And that animal is the size of my hand. He was at death's door. The sedatives helped. None of the lubricants did anything. So we came up with this novel idea that we'd strap a woman's... I know a lot of you are going, oh, God, I can see that now. Hope he doesn't look at me. A woman's sexual aid vibrator. Don't say you don't know what it is, Rob. He knows. So we strapped it to its plastron twice a day for 5 minutes. And it was essentially a vibrating massager that helped to move the stone. Within 4 days, 50% of the stones were out. Within just a few weeks, his digestive system was clean. And tortoise is doing great today. We were so pleased with these results that we published a paper in a very nice journal. You can imagine some of the comments we got for that. And the editor was wanting to know, very picky journal, good old style journal like that. He wanted to know, the address of the manufacturer, the model number. I began to get a little bit suspicious, I have to say. But then when he received the address and details of the manufacturer, it was something like, I'm going to make it up, but it was something like Sexy Vibrators, Sex Street, Sex Town. It was a postcode, of course. And so he said, all right, we'll forget the address because we've got standards. But of all the papers that I've worked on, and I've published probably about 150 peer-reviewed papers over the years, this was the one that got me the best recognition I think I've ever had, and deserved, because the sex industry got hold of it and said, hey, we can increase our sales. There's a whole new dimension for our vibrators. I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to be in this. That was great. No free subscription to it or anything like that. But, I don't carry that much weight. A quick thing on social dependence and so on, because this is one of the paradigms that demonstrates the unfixability, in a way, of keeping animals in captivity. And I could give you loads of them. Some animals in captivity, and Anthony will point out more of this, I'm sure, in more detail, because he's way above my head on this. But some species, it may be either wise or essential to keep them together. Primates, perhaps lovebirds, if that's a good example, I don't know. But it's one I put up anyway. You may need to keep them together. They're a social species. But that logic doesn't always follow. Because down at the bottom here, we have bearded dragons. The very bearded dragons that you saw earlier on, under the light, if you remember the restricted provision issue. Bearded dragons do two things, incidentally. They're either under the light or they're trying to get out. And that's because that environment up there in the picture I showed you half an hour ago was the environment they're familiar with when they can get hot under it. And after that, they frankly want out. So they get into this interaction with transparent boundaries, the snout rubbing scenario we've talked about 5 minutes ago. But these are also highly sociable lizards. They live in huge expanses of desert in Australia in nature. But in captivity, they can't do that, so they bite each other's feet and tails off. And so they're an example of a social species that can't be kept in a social environment, so it's a double whammy. It's a negative loop and you can't fix it. Again, I've stolen a little bit of information from my buddy Greg Glendale, who's the bird behaviorist, and I won't go through all these individually, but you can see the split, essentially. Parrots in the wild, the features of that existence. They're outdoors, different environments, very varied. They have flocks and so on, raised by their own parents. And they're treated as a parrot. I mean, let's face it, other parrots treat them as a parrot. Versus those indoors, those in captivity, they're missing out on the natural stimuli, which can be said for virtually all these captive exotic animals. The temperatures and so on be set, not the same as they were, small habitats, easily imprinted by people who, to them, are probably abusers in many cases. and then they're treated as a human, so they're confused animals. And what often happens with things like parrots, macaws, and cockatoos is they come out of this process disturbed. They go to someone's home, they say, actually, this bird's playing up. Doesn't have time to settle with that one, pick up more bad habits, and on they go, until some of them become, I don't mean it in any derogatory term at all, well, they effectively become nutcases because of people. And I've heard them described as a naughty 3-year-old with a pair of pliers for a face. Because if you've ever been bitten by a macaw, you'll know what that person's talking about. And the net result of all of that is that there are, like with so many other animals, sanctuaries laden with the cast-offs, the cases that, frankly, people couldn't manage and didn't want to manage, and it wasn't what they thought. Hardly surprising. I can't leave fish out because of all the things I've said in terms of reptiles and their awareness and so on. You have to take that down the evolutionary scale, something I hate because I don't really think of animals as being up and down the evolutionary scale. They're all here and they're all now, so I give them a pretty even platform myself. Fish feel pain, that's for sure. In some cases, you can argue that you have to give them special sensitivities because just touching a fish with a salty, nasty, acidic hand can damage their skin. Same with amphibians. They live in an environment that they cannot avoid. If you don't like the smell outside, well, go somewhere else, come indoors. Whatever. They're in a water which the quality of the water has to be set good enough for them. And we're not even sure whether the people setting it really know what they're doing at all. But you can imagine now you're in an aquatic environment, the oxygen has to be right, what contaminants are in there. If it's a marine fish, is the salt level right? Does it need to vary? Can they get it? What's the temperature? They can't avoid those things, they're swimming around in it. We come back to that issue of it's so stressful for them to be moved, you have to ply them with antibiotics to stop them dying of disease en route. Fish getting understimulated. Now, in just a minute, you'll be thinking, fish getting bored. Cliff, are you serious now? I am. Go look up the scientific literature on fish behavior. They get understimulated. And one of the things that comes from that is co-occupant aggression, injuries. You see the fish biting each other, chasing them around the tanks. It's not always a case of just one wanting to mate, but that can be bad enough because if one doesn't want to mate, it's being pursued by someone who's hassling it. Grief? You're thinking, is that a misprint? No. There have been scientific studies that show that fish grieve, kill one. I'm not suggesting you do it. One dies, and the other one doesn't want to eat for weeks. It's miserable. Goes and hides itself away. It grieves. Well, now you've got to have lost it, haven't you, Cliff? Because I'm saying essentially that most of those things apply to these guys, the invertebrates, the scorpions, the spiders. Actually, I'm not the one who's saying it. The scientists who work on these animals are saying it. They feel pain, they're physically sensitive, they have, look at the list, it goes on. You could almost put, you haven't seen grief in it yet, but maybe someone just hasn't researched and described it. But essentially, you've got the same story wherever you go. Right, quickly recap on the session so far, which is all about mortality, morbidity, welfare, with a couple of the numbers. If you think about the pre-sale mortality rate of the wholesalers, 70% mortality rate, industry standard. 75% of reptiles die in 1 year in the home, probably a conservative estimate. 90% mortality, fish in the home. And we know the saga of mortality before that is dreadful. Right, invasive alien species. These are the species that are in the wrong place because of us. They've been moved around the world because of us. Here you have an American alligator, and here you have a python. This is a Burmese python brought into the United States through the pet trade, and they've now invaded swamps and so on down in the wetlands in Florida. They've taken over. Eradication programs are in place. They've been in place for a while. They won't work. They'll never work. They're here to stay. The trade has been banned in certain species. Too little, too late. They're here, and they're virtually hoovering up everything. In fact, they've become the second apex predator next to the alligator. Chytriomycosis, or chytrid disease, is a fungus that's absolutely infesting amphibians virtually all over the world. The pet trade is partly responsible for that dissemination, and it is a devastating disease that's affecting these frogs. You can cure a few of them with veterinary attention, but when you're trying to deal with this on a worldwide scale, it's a disaster. It's an ecological mess. Invasive alien species, and it's not even just the frogs that's the issue, it's the pathogen, remember, the fungus that the frog's carrying now. And the scale of these things can come about from seemingly nowhere. This is an example, for instance, of the guppies. Most people are familiar with guppies, and this is saying that a single pregnant guppy can effectively invade the water. That's the damage that a single pregnant guppy can do, so you can just imagine what devastation can be brought by a married one. And it costs hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide. So the benefits of the pet trade financially could be offset just by this whole issue of invasive alien species. And that bill includes plants and so on, but more and more animals are getting involved in this. And we've only assessed something like 10, 13, whatever % of the invasive species that are out there when we make up that bill of billions of dollars. So there's an actually huge set of these invasive species that haven't been assessed yet. Pet markets, you call them like expos over here, are popular around many parts of the world, US and Europe, and they are an absolute nightmare. These are birds, and you can quickly see that the opportunities at these markets for the interaction with people and birds is one, not only disturbing for the birds, but in the case of outbreak of disease, it's a nightmare. A feather becomes potentially a mini airship of infection spreading bugs around the place, and in somewhere like this, which has 100,000 birds and many, many people, it's a nightmare. These expos are disastrous and they should go. Birds sitting on the floor, huddled up with their backs to you, is a bad sign. They're not happy. Birds on offer, birds cramped in cages, being looked down on by them, what could be a predator, disturbing situations. Here's one, no feathers, what'll I get for it? Give me an offer. This is a reptile event in Spain. You get the picture, loads and loads of people touching loads and loads of animals. This is no way for an animal to be living its life, not even in a temporary environment at all. And a lot of these things aren't even that temporary because they go into the back of a white van, get driven 500 miles to another event. Trade says it's only temporary, it doesn't matter, really. This handsome devil at the end here is me, and these are turtles that are virtually all wild caught. None of the captive bred ones there, and in fact we were finding species here that we couldn't even identify, and later on we found that they weren't even known to science. So that's how well controlled the exotic pet trade is. Hundreds and hundreds of animals being handled like they were vegetables on a store. We did a study to look at the behavioral responses in these animals and found that, in fact, of the 1,500 that we looked at, nearly half of them were showing signs of stress if you looked at them for just 5 minutes. When it came to the invasive species at pet markets, there were 179 species there that we saw, which is quite a diversity, given that when you think of cats and dogs, you're looking essentially at 2 species. And believe it or not, there are 4,000 species of these exotics in trade. What hope does your vet or inspector have of identifying all these animals, let alone knowing the intricacies of their lifestyle, much of which aren't even scientifically known to us, so there's no chance to it. But 28% of those are already identified as invasive alien species, shouldn't even really be there, adding to the costs and the problems. Who's behind it all? Well, basically, a lot of the time, yes, there may be some nice people who you'd quite happily have to dinner, but a lot of the reptile and exotic pet trade generally is full of some crooks. 25 to 44% of wildlife trade generally is illegal, taking endangered species. If you can get a box with a parrot or a tortoise through it, you can get a box full of drugs too. And on to zoonoses. Well, zoonoses are essentially conditions that are transferable from one animal to another, and you can get reverse zoonoses. Cold sore on you is no big deal. Cold sore from a human to a gibbon kills it in 3 days. But they're effectively the new Trojan horses because we invite these animals into our homes unbeknownst to us to maybe dwell within them a huge diversity of potential pathogens, Trojan horses. There are about 200 of these zoonoses. They span the usual suspects, viruses like avian influenza, bacterial, salmonellosis, parasites, worms, and so on, funguses, ringworm, all that sort of thing. And then we have these little prions that are involved for like mad cow disease. Very difficult to try and get rid of those things. About 200 of these zoonoses overall, as I said. 70 of them are associated with animals in zoos and the pet trade, and just 40 of them, tiny number, involved just in reptiles and amphibians. Tiny number being a bit of facetiousness there. You go, I guess, picked up on that. Transmission routes, well, you have direct and indirect. You can touch the animal or you can touch its environment. Well, sometimes touching the environment can be worse than the animal, as we may see. Fecal oral, very common one. That's just touching whatever it is, the germs, and putting them in your mouth. You have the orbital tract, where these bugs can get down through your eye, believe it or not, and through your ear, and through your skin if you have open sores. And in the case of people handling animals with claws, they make the openings for themselves and the bugs get in that way. We have these fomites, which are basically bugs transferred everywhere. And this is where hand washing becomes a complete nonsense. Yes, it helps. It's sensible, of course, to do the hand washing. And the government and virtually all the pet trade have just said, oh, you just hand wash. Nonsense. You can put 2 pairs of rubber gloves on, handle an animal, and then test your hands afterwards. You're very likely to have the pathogens on your hands anyway. You can scrub up like a surgeon or a vet and still pass the infections on. Worse than that, you'll minimize the bugs, but worse than that is the fact that nearly always the environment in which the animal is kept becomes subtly and grossly contaminated over time. You touch the animal, you touch the door handle, you touch the wall, the friend touches the door handle, touches the wall, touches the floor, touches the table, you touch your clothes, you touch your hair. Go wash your hands, touch your body again, you're recontaminated. The only way not to get infected for sure is to not have an exotic pet. That should be the message. Travel through droplets in the air and blood transfusions. Of all things, people are getting through blood transfusions. Typical signs and symptoms, though, are gastrointestinal, vomiting and the diarrhea. Influenza-like. Now, this woman on the right, she's either got a very high temperature or just found out she's pregnant, but either way, looks like bad news to me. And dermal signs, ringworm in this case, very nasty. It doesn't only affect your skin sometimes, ringworm, it can become an entirely infectious systemic disease. But here's the interesting thing about this, that so many of these zoonoses superficially resemble things like gastroenteritis and things we know about and we're familiar with, that we pass them off as things that we've picked up elsewhere. And the GP or physician over here often doesn't say, yeah, do you have an animal in your house? Because you may well want to and need to treat the zoonoses infection that superficially looks like plain gastroenteritis. You may want to treat it very differently from the plain way. And so it means that many of these diseases are being masked by the fact that people just presume it wasn't the reptile, it was the bad curry I had that caused this. Look at these horrible statistics if I quickly rush through them. The trade in baby turtles in the US was causing about 280,000 cases of salmonellosis in humans every year until they banned it in 1975. Canada banned it in 1976. The year that it was banned, the cases dropped 77% in 1 year, which shows just how effective bans are. The education didn't work, and it doesn't work today. It doesn't work today because we have, in fact, 74,000 cases of reptile-related salmonellosis in humans every year now. And although the baby turtle trade was banned, the trade swapped to snakes and lizards, which of course we handle more and arguably in many respects therefore are even worse. So the cases are on the rise. In the UK we have about 6,000 cases of this disease every year. Look at this nasty little statistic down here, which follows from a study done by hospitals in the south of the UK. They were getting a lot of cases of unusual salmonellas, difficult to treat salmonella infections in children. And when they analysed them, they found that actually 27% of all the salmonella infections that they were getting in the hospitalised cases with children were actually coming just from the fact that they were keeping reptiles as pets. The antibiotic resistance thing, believe me, it's there. There are reams of stuff on this now. It's so interesting. But anyway, of the 32 species of freshwater fish that were studied, 77% of them had tetracycline in them, which means that these animals are laden with antibiotic, and that's not good news, as I said earlier on, when you come to treat them. And so they're being routinely used, as I mentioned. And how does all this disastrous situation come about? How could it have persisted for so long? Well, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this, but in the commercial sectors, we have this term locked in. Not the psychological condition locked in to bad practices. And the best example used is the QWERTY keyboard. We're all familiar with keyboards on our pads and our phones and computers and so on. And the keys are actually in a relatively irregular position. It doesn't go A, B, C, D all the way down. Here's QWERTY. Now that's something that for whatever reason was invented, and now it's also taught in colleges and universities around the world and manufactured standard in all the phones and things we use, Blackberries and goodness knows what else. What that means is that you can't simply change the keyboard without changing the teaching and then changing the mobile phone manufacturers and so on. And so this is an example of where a practice is locked in until a better way comes along. You can't really get out of it easily. And exactly the same phenomenon has acted for the exotic pet trade for years, and it's why it's still the way it is. Very quickly, the current situation is we have an industry, a structure, administration, and so on, and it's very trade favourable for the lock-in. It starts with the fact that we have a reactive process. The industry doesn't go out and just change things. We have to go and find out what the problem is, and that can mean years of walking around making papers in rainforests and so on, investigators going in, doing all these sorts of things, chasing what our heads started destructive processes. That's compounded by the fact that we have an overdiversity, 4,000 species of animals in trade, from which the trade can choose and chop and change from and to as and when it wants, which is very difficult, therefore, to narrow down a specific number and study and learn them so that they can't confuse border control and all the rest of it. So that overdiversity simply spreads the problem out so that it's hiding everywhere in plain sight, in a sense. The burden of proof is always not on trade, but on the enforcement agencies and the scientists to come up with the evidence to try and get it stopped. That's a problem for us, that's expensive for us, it's expensive for charities, it costs people money, that means it's a huge cost for everybody trying to chase this process. Monitoring, enforcement, and so on is expensive. It's difficult to do. Trying to get to the remote areas where these animals are captured is extremely difficult. My job was special forces trained to go down into remote deserts and so on and chase these people around. It could be taking me 2 weeks to find where one dealer's operating. You're not going to get some government scientists wandering around doing that. Then you have the regional holding sites, hard to find, transportation's hard to cover, and pet stores is difficult to inspect. So that adds to the problem. Then we have enforcement. Enforcement's expensive, it's under-resourced, it's often a low priority for local authorities. New legislation is hard to implement. And because of all of this, it's essentially easy to get away with bad behaviour, so evasion's easy. And then when something does come around that we've actually finally managed to persuade the government to have a look at, it's highly opposed by the trade and industry, which means it brings us right back to the beginning, and this circle is self-feeding in favour of trade and not animal welfare, environment or people. And at the heart of it is a system called the negative list. The negative list essentially means that everything is a free-for-all until you can prove that it should be banned. And one of the problems behind all of this is the fact that we have the trade pushing animals all the time. Out comes a film and they say, right, well, let's sell that animal. These animals don't survive in captivity, they need their coral, so they die in huge numbers. We have messaging from the industry pushing the trade. We can give it proper care. No, you can't. There's a proper way to turn a nut or a bolt. To the right tightens, to the left loosens. Turn it to the left to tighten it, doesn't work. There's a proper way to do something. You can't properly keep animals in captivity. It's not possible to properly do it because they're not supposed to be here. They'll often push them as easy to keep. Wrong. That they're low maintenance. Wrong. Starter animal. Wrong. Good for allergies. Not good for allergies. Wrong. You might not have a good allergic reaction to a dog, but they're not good for allergies. Good for small apartments. Wrong. Then they market them like this. This is a premium habitat. It's about 60 centimeters. Premium habitat in which an animal should spend its entire life. Seriously? Here's the old business of, well, we'll have 2 for 1, 30% off, buy this, get one free. That pushes people to buy them. National Geographic's logo? People will say, I'll take that, never mind the rest. It's got National Geographic's logo on it. It can't be bad. It is. It's about a 4-year-old girl holding a snake. The government, even the pet trade, are trying to say now, very reluctantly, you shouldn't really have it, you know, if you've got a child under 5. She's about 4. And here we have her handling a python as a promotion. Here's this whole thing. It's a beginner's animal. No, it's not. I've been working in reptile biology, behavior, science, studying them in the wild. I can't keep one of these animals stress-free in captivity if you gave me the biggest budget in the world. Apparently it's beginner's level. And it's supported by this absolute avalanche of garbage that the pet industry put out. Get a toaster, instruction manuals this thick. Get a reptile, 3 pieces of paper, that's fine, that's absolutely right. It all comes down to this whole miseducation philosophy that they depend on. It pushes business. So what are the solutions? Well, yeah, education, of course. We're never going to give up on education, but it hasn't worked, and it probably won't work. We can produce all the leaflets, high quality we want. This is an example of a system that we've developed to try and get the system, to get people as early as possible to realize that keeping an animal is problematic. And for that, what we've developed is, I can't go through the whole thing, don't have the time, but essentially we've pre-weighted animals based on doing borrowed scientific scoring mechanisms, and it allows people to look, say 18 points is what the animal's assigned if it's a reptile, and then you ask yourself several questions. Is it a small sensitive animal? You add points. Is it an animal that definitely needs a compatriot and you don't have room for it? You add another few points. Is it an animal that's potentially dangerous to you as well? You add a few points. And down the bottom here's a scoring mechanism. You add up the numbers and it tells you whether it comes from easy through to extreme. The pet trade doesn't like it because most animals come in the higher categories than they believe. Looking very quickly and getting towards our conclusion, I wanted to look at this whole thing, the difference between a toy versus a real animal. In the case of a toy, which you can buy from Toys R Us, and I did, I normally bring it with me as an example. It's not because I get lonely, but it helps. It has no sharp edges. You can't pull the eyes out so your child can't accidentally choke on it or poke itself in the eye with a piece of wire that was behind the toy's eye. It's quite safe. You can clean it and boil it, do anything you want with it, make sure it will be clean. It's even fire resistant, so it can survive a fire when you die. That's nice. In this case, it's got labels stitched in which show that it's passed all the independent safety tests that were required before it could be allowed to be sold. Compare that with a turtle you can walk down the street and simply buy. It'll bite, it will scratch, it is easily harmed, unlike the turtle. You cannot clean them, it is impossible to clean them. They're almost certainly going to be infective at one stage in your home. You virtually can't keep it well, certainly not to any standards that I would consider acceptable. And if it did have any ID labels in it, it would guarantee it's an unsafe product. Moderate solutions. Well, obviously, the better informed our inspectors are, good. Making environment and animal welfare centric decisions rather than making them in favour of the pet trade. Oh, I know Jim, he seems to be a good guy. I don't see why you would do any harm. Forget that. If you see something bad, black mark. And the introduction of positive lists. Positive lists work this way. I'm on a positive list, you're on a positive list if you have a driving license. Nobody said to you one day, hey, it's really what, go out, push that pedal, see what happens. Crash it? Well, no. You needed a driving license before you could drive a car. So you're on a positive list, as is this building. It wasn't thrown up overnight. It had to jump through hoops to get to it, same as your car, same as many products. You have to have these positive lists, and we need animals to be on the positive list as well. In summary, the negative list, which is the way things are done now, means that the authorities are continually trying to catch up, as I mentioned in that diagram, with the problem. There's no evidence base to show that the species are actually suitable as pets. All the evidence says that they're not. There's a greater diversity than we can cope with. And so with the positive list, and it's in 2 countries in Europe, and 8 others are thinking of adopting it, and it's in 3 provinces in Canada, and it's been shown to work. It means the evidence, the burden of evidence is on the person to prove that that animal is safe. And that means if we've got enough evidence for that, we've got enough evidence to show you how to look after them. Very quickly, if you've got a child in the family, we know immediately that our genetics have governed the way in which we looked after that animal. If all else fails, our genetics tell us how to look after it. Then we have family to back up, friends, midwives, nurses, and all these are highly trained professionals, pediatricians, doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, behaviorists, you know what they are. Would we really say, and all the paraphernalia books to go with it, and everything from how to get pregnant through to how to deal with this and that, would we say that bringing up a child is easy, given all that background? We're nearly always calling on these people for help. And compare that with having an exotic pet. You're not just talking about a slightly different species of human, a slightly different race. There are different species, often a different class of animal. Different biology, behavior, psychology, nutrition, much of which we really don't even know what they need. The information that's out there is poor and counterintuitive and counterproductive to welfare. The blind are leading the blind in terms of the people who are trying to tell you how to look after them. And the bulk of evidence says, they really shouldn't be in captivity at all. And the fallback options are very, very poor. Proper care, forget it. Not such a thing. In the UK, at least, the chances of winning the lottery are to find 6 numbers out of 49. There are thousands of these variables when it comes to looking after a reptile. The chances, and any other animal, the chances of getting them all right are ridiculous. And in the case of a lottery, just 6 out of 9 gives you only a miserable 14.5 to 1 million chance of winning it. You have no chance of getting it right with the animals. Would we accept this? No. We wouldn't accept this. We simply wouldn't. A dog in a cage under these conditions, you'd likely be prosecuted for it. What about this? This is a perfect example of what Temple Grandin said a couple of days ago at a presentation of bad becoming normal. And I think that if anyone finds this acceptable, as many reptile keepers, traders and hobbyists do, and some vets who support those trades, if they find that acceptable, they are exposing their lack of qualification to comment on the issue. So here we have, I think my penultimate slide, by Professor Gordon Burghardt, the guy who has in many respects picked up where I left off. And he says that even in zoos, we're not talking about the low level now of the pet trade, in zoos, the chances of being able to look after these animals is so slim that he just refers to it as keeping them under conditions of controlled deprivation. And they should be honest that that's what they're doing. So in trade summary, and last of my slides, the trade is out of control. Make no mistake, the trade is out of control. Historical attempts at controlling it have failed. Education, negative lists have failed. The diversity is an issue, conservation is an issue, invasive alien species, welfare, public health, antimicrobial resistance. And I think trying to get to many, if not all, of the pet traders involved, the profiteers, is a mistake. We're never going to get there. They are bent on making money, and they're a lost cause. Some herpetologists are not such bad guys, but they have to unlearn what they've learned. They think their heads are full of knowledge about keeping these animals in captivity. Essentially, we have to put a line through what they know and get them to start again, because their heads are full of stuff that is destructive, and it's a perfect example of that bad becoming normal. They must relearn. And they must relearn using not the information that they've been accustomed to, but what the modern scientists are telling them. And finally, the positive lists that I mentioned are the way forward. Governments are now adopting them. They turn the tide in our favor so that animals cannot be kept unless you can prove absolutely that they should be kept. Thanks for that.